I always have to wonder about the story of the people that live there and what their lives were like and what made them just up and leave. Sometimes the stuff looks like they left yesterday or a week ago. What was happening in their lives that they just left everything?
There's that, and then there's also, for me, someone coming from a big-ish city, just standing in there and thinking, how on earth is this stuff even still here? All these, probably 10, 15, 20 years later, because if that had happened in the city, this thing would have just been ransacked and trashed.
Right.
But there's, that tends not to happen in a place like this. And I guess there's, what's the closest thing that I have come to it in, it's not exactly the same thing, but last time I went to America, we were over on the West Coast, and I deliberately timed a visit to Salton Sea around the full moon. I don't know have you ever been out to the Salton Sea?
I've wanted to go, and I've seen your pictures, and yeah.
So you know about it, because the funny thing is I've mentioned it to several Americans, and they've never heard of the place, which I find really strange, but...
I think within the abandoned photography community, people know. But that's not. Yeah, that's one of those places that I don't think a whole lot of people know about.
Yeah. The only thing is, I suppose, with a lot of this sort of abandoned style photography now, is that a lot of places become picked over by so many people. And Salton Sea is, as I say, it's a big target for photographers like that now, and. I've, possibly partly responsible in a way. There's a lot of people doing photographs of abandoned houses in the Hebrides. I've never, ever claimed that I was the first person to do it because, people are photographing stuff like that for years. But they did achieve a certain level of exposure in the media, So I've kind of stepped away from... No, if I stumbled across a really interesting property, I would no doubt go and photograph it, and just because. But I don't actively go out searching for it now. I've kind of just waiting for the next thing to come into my head that I can get.
Right.
Well, I've got an ongoing project at the moment, and that's actually featuring people for a change. And I don't know if you've seen any of those photos. It's all based on people who live and work in the Outer Hebrides, because that was one of my early sort of questions to myself about this place. Like you were saying earlier about when you were talking about the radio ham stuff and, difficult to this remote place called the Outer Hebrides. Well, when I was a kid, I was fascinated with I thought the name was great. I just wondered, what do people do? People live there. What the hell do they do? And then you kind of move up here and you realize that, well, actually, what most people do here is probably similar to what most people do anywhere. It's just that they're doing it here instead of in a city. That has its own thing, like I've done a photograph of the guy and the girl that go around on the mobile bank. A mobile bank isn't something that you see everywhere. So the opportunity to photograph those people doing the job that they do, but the photo also featuring, like, giving you an idea of, like, look where they're doing it. It looks amazing. It makes just that combination. I think the combination of the job, the people that are doing it, but also where they're doing it as well. I'm trying to capture the three things in one picture if I can. So that's a little ongoing thing that I'm doing.
Sure. And I'm sure you've run into people who were once inhabitants of the abandoned properties that you've photographed. Have you gained any insight from that?
Yeah. When I went out to do the pictures, I never actually tried to find any information out. I do quite like the idea of just not really knowing the story, and then sort of possibly little scenarios will run through my mind when I'm in there taking the picture, and also later when I'm looking at the picture. Sometimes I see things in the picture that I never noticed when I was actually in there. But as a result of the pictures appearing in various places, then people have surfaced, and I have heard some of the stories attached to some of these houses. There's you may know this story already because I've discussed it with a couple of people on done a couple of TV crews have been around, but there's one where we went in this house and there was a calendar on the wall, 1997, and I was surprised actually because I thought surely there was nobody living in here in 1997, and apparently what happened is I think the couple that used to live in the house, I'm pretty sure they moved away to the mainland, and the house got left. Nobody took it on. Pretty much everything was left in the house. But about once a year, if they could do it, a couple of the members of the family, like daughters, would just go back, like a little pilgrimage to that house, and they'd light a fire in the stove, and they just sit there, sort of have a think about mum and dad and reminisce about the old days. And that was a little, almost like a little ceremony thing that they do once a year if they could make it.
Right. Yeah, that's not dissimilar to what I've experienced here too. As this area and the islands that I live on become more gentrified and more developed, there's really an issue of higher taxes pushing the African American community out of these islands. And in many cases, it'll be like Granny's house. And once Granny passes away, the family is in Atlanta or somewhere far away, and maybe they'll keep it for a few years and come back, do like a similar thing, and then the lure of the money gets to become too much, and the house gets sold, or in some cases abandoned before it gets sold, which is where I come in with the camera and everything. But it's a similar situation to the islands here.
It sounds very similar, in fact. Yeah, and I think. We've had there was one instance where I'd put some photos from one particular property on my website. Now, I've always been careful not to identify where it is. I'll say what island it's on, but I won't say it's in this village or whatever. And then I put this little selection of pictures from this one particular house on, and then about 2 days later, I got a phone call from somebody, and she was saying that she was a granddaughter of the people who lived in that house, and she said she was sort of quite upset about it. And so I thought, well, I'm not doing this to upset anybody at all. If you prefer, I'll actually take those pictures off my website so they're not there to be seen. And she says, no, it wasn't that. It's just that it brought up a lot of emotions, and I just felt it would be nice to talk to you, and I could explain to you a little bit about what happened to that house. And okay, that's tell me. And what had happened there was I think the original inhabitants had passed on. The house had got left to someone in the family, eldest daughter or something. It's usually the way it goes. And that person was living away, not on the island anymore. They were on the mainland, and they were saying, "Well, yeah, I am going to come back to the island one day, and the house will get renovated, and so on and so on." And they'll have meant that when they said it, but of course it never happened. So the remaining the family members that were still on the island were just year after year watching this house slowly deteriorate, and it got to the point where it caused a bit of a rift and ill feeling between the one that was away that was keeping the house and the ones that were here watching it fall to pieces. It's sort of quite sad, really, to see that it happened that way. Sort of. Someone passing on, and this property ended up causing problems in that family. Meanwhile, the whole thing's falling to pieces, and it just gets to a point where it's just not practical to do anything with. And there's been various reactions to some of these houses, and a lot of the weird stuff comes from people who know nothing about the island. They sort of take it upon themselves to get offended by the fact that they've been allowed to fall into disrepair, they're saying, "Oh, I would move there in a heartbeat," and so on. But actually, you will know probably yourself as someone who goes and actually visits some of these houses. They, with the best will in the world, somebody today, if they took one of these old properties on, many of them are not fit to be renovated to any decent standard. Some of them are not built on like proper foundations. They were just, in the old days, somebody from a family would say, "Yeah, you can put a house over there," and they'd just go and build something, and it kind of, they obviously they did live in it, they got by, but it's not the sort of thing that anybody would do today, and it wouldn't pass any form of building reg tests either.
Sure, yeah.
If you did try to bring it up to spec, it'd cost you more than building a new one.
Right. I've read too. I guess they're called Croft houses, which is kind of similar to what we have here. We would call that a tenant house for a tenant farmer. They were given a little plot of land and they were allowed to build their home. And as you said, zero specifications on how to build the home. They just built it in a vernacular fashion to whatever was on hand. How were families given this land? I'm taking that's just like kind of a government thing in Scotland. I'm taking it, right?
Yeah, that's a very complicated subject, and I can't claim to be an expert on it. But some of this Croft thing goes back a long way, and particularly after World War One, when the surviving men came back to the island, and they were promised that they would be, given land, a sufficient piece of land to sustain themselves on, and so parcels of land were divided up into crofts to allow people to build a house, and they could, they've got enough land there to put a cow on it and maybe a few sheep, and so a very subsistence type of form of living. Over the years, there have been various government schemes, grants available to help crofters build a house. But it's crofting. Obviously, it still exists. It's nothing like the way it used to be, and I guess here on Harris and other crofting areas in Scotland, we're seeing pretty much as you're describing. The gentrification of places. People who want to buy a house might come up for sale, and maybe the local people here can't afford it because people who want to buy it as a second home have got more money, and they buy it. It takes houses out of the housing market. It gets all quite complicated and political. But it's I don't see it as anything new. It's happening all over the UK and happening all over different parts of the world. It's a relatively new phenomenon up here. So it's it's just things happen here a little slower than they do everywhere else, but we're eventually catching up, and we're seeing that gentrification process taking place now.
Are there any notable examples of a home that you photographed when it was derelict that's been renovated now to where it's something kind of spectacular? Because the architecture in some of these places, particularly the ones that it seems to me they're built probably, well, like you said, around the World War I era, with the dual chimneys on either end, they're just quaint and really beautiful houses. I see why someone would want to take one and renovate it and make it into something again.
Well, there was when the derelict properties, those interior shots that I was doing, when they were first starting to get exhibited and get a bit of notice, I was contacted by a government-funded body whether they could use some of those images on the cover of a fuel poverty report, because the Western Isles apparently has the worst incidences of fuel poverty in the whole of the UK, and the guy thought these images would help attract attention and so on. So there was a move then to a couple of organisations got interested, and they put funds, or they said they would provide funding for one of these properties to be restored or rebuilt, sort of rejuvenated and so on. And they went round looking, trying to find one, and nothing ever came of it in the end. But one day, there's a house actually quite close to where I am right now. It's one of the houses that I photographed, and it's lay empty for, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years. And a guy called in to tell me that he'd just bought it, and he was going to have it renovated. And he wanted, before he went in and stripped the whole place out, he would like me to go and take a picture of him, his wife, and their young daughter. She was only about 3 at the time, in the house as it was. The aim being that when they finally do get it renovated and move in, go back, and we get the after. We've got the before picture, and we'll have an after picture. And I thought, well, this is fantastic, because this that rounds off that whole project. That'll be a really great ending to it, and make a great story as well. So so far, I've got the photo that I took when it was just abandoned. I've then got the photo of him and his wife and the young daughter in there before they started stripping everything out. And then, this is only about 6-8 weeks ago, he called in to see me again, and he said, well, that plan isn't going to happen, because what they did was they figured initially that the 4 walls were sound, and then they just rip everything out, which they did, and then start rebuilding up from there. They even had an architect, went to an architect, got all the plans drawn up for the new version of the interior and how it was going to be insulated and so on. Ultimately, the guy said to them, look, this is actually going to be cheaper to pull the whole thing down and just start from scratch. And I totally sympathise with him, and I can see the practicalities of that. So I got some pictures of the thing being demolished. But the cool thing is, the plans that they had drawn up were for the renovation of the original building. The new house plans are based on that. So ultimately, on that site, there is going to be a brand new house, but it's going to look very suspiciously like the old one, except a bit more 21st century version of it. So one day that is going to happen. So that'll be quite nice. But I think what it shows up is the practicalities when it comes down to it, of renovating one of these old properties. It's like you're kind of making a rod for your own back, and ultimately, as is the case with this one, it may well be more sensible and more financially viable to just start from scratch.
I remembered that photo you were talking about, and while you were talking, I pulled that up, and it's I see Matilda there on the stove. She's such
Matilda,
a cutie.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. Brilliant photograph.
Yeah.
In a house like that, what is it made of? Is this a stone house, or is this some sort of concrete, or what's the construction?
Well, that one, of all the old houses, the derelict, empty houses that I photographed, that was definitely the one that was most likely to be suitable for a rebuild, because that's actually huge stone blocks that was made out of. Apparently, again, because I know the guy, he looked a bit into the history of the house. That was built in the late 1800s by a sort of fairly renowned stonemason, I gather. So it will have been, in its day, really good quality, and potentially, possibly would have been okay. The 4 outer walls may have been okay, but when they weighed up, how much investment it would take to use those as a basis, it was just a little bit too risky.
Right.
Now, most of the other houses that I photographed, I got involved doing a series of photographs for an architectural project that took place here on the islands 2 or 3 years ago. And the guy that was running that explained to me there used to be, back around, I think it was in the 30s, 40s, 50s maybe, they had a thing called the penny plan. And it was something that somebody commissioned an architect to draw up a plan for people to build their own houses. And you could buy these plans off whoever for a penny, and you use that as your blueprint to build your house. And there were three versions. There was like the cheapest version was a middle one, and then the most expensive version was you would build the entire house out of stone or possibly poured concrete. But the cheapest version, and I have got one of my favourite photos that I've taken down on an island called Vatersay. All that remains of the house is the two gable ends. And what that was, the only stone that was used there was for the gable ends. The two long walls, front and back, would be corrugated tin. And that was the cheapest version of the penny plan. So typically, the houses that were built like that and were abandoned, the gable ends will survive way, way longer than the front and rear walls because they'll just rot away. And so it's just an amazing seeing that. Well, I can't call it a house. It's just two stone gable ends and just this gap in between. And I went along there and got this, what I thought was a clever idea of lighting it as if it was an intact house. I made it all like it was lit internally, as if the light was pouring out from within, but there was actually no front or rear walls on it, just the gable ends.
Right. I'm looking at that photograph right now, Caught by the River. That's the one?
Oh, yeah, it was featured on that website. Yeah, I wrote a piece about it for them. Yeah, that's
okay.
The one.
Yeah, we have very similar here in these islands, of course, using the locally available material. We have sand and oyster shells, so they would make a concrete that they called tabby, and pretty much all of the remaining British colonial era buildings that are standing are the ones that were made out of brick or tabby, because the wooden parts have long ago rotted away, but that tabby and that brick still stands. Although really precious little of it nowadays.
Yeah, and that's... it does sound really similar, and I guess you'll get that the world over, just in different forms, because that thing of you use what's available, because those big stones and stuff can't really carry them that far, so it'll probably all be pretty locally sourced. And there's another house, really cool little house that I photographed. I've done the interior and I did the exterior as well, because that was one of those where it's two stone gables and then the front wall was corrugated, rotting tin, and I think it's still standing, although word is that it may be due for demolition at some point. And you just think, why can't you just leave it? But what happened was one of the corrugated tin sheets blew off. And obviously, we get some really strong gales here, like seriously. You can get over 100-mile winds. So occasionally that will happen, and you imagine an 8x4 sheet of corrugated tin flying through 100 miles an hour could cause some serious damage to somebody. So it's like, one day maybe they should just take down the tin and leave the two ends standing, But I think that's the deal that's the attraction to the photography side of it. It's like just go and get a nice picture of it. And then if it gets knocked down next week, at least it's been documented. You've got something to show for how it was. There
have been times, too, where I've photographed a structure and then seemingly the next day it gets knocked down, and I worry that I was the reason. Yeah.
Well, there was one years and years ago when I was really intensely into the late-night photography. There was a little... They called it the fever hospital. That's what it was known as locally. I used to drive past it regularly, and I kept saying to myself, when the conditions are right, I'm going to come back and photograph this, because it was all made out of the roof, the walls, the whole thing was made out of corrugated tin, and it was all red rusty, but it just looked really cool. And it was called a fever hospital, kind of a joke, because it was only like enough room for maybe one single bed in there. This is the story I was told. that back in the, you're probably going back to the early part of the 20th century, is that TB was quite a common thing up on the islands then, and that some houses, when they had a member of the family that was suffering from TB, they would actually build something at the end of the house and put that person in there so they could look after them but keep them away basically from everybody else. And that's what this little tin shack was. And I was driving back past one day, and then it was like, oh, it's flattened. It's completely gone. And just kicking myself that, the number of times I've gone past it and said, I'll get that one day, I'll get that one day. And it's like, sometimes you just have to, like, take the effort to just go and do it, because it might not be there tomorrow.
You kind of take for granted, particularly, I guess, if they're close and you see them all the time and you're more focused.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Because some of my favourite pictures over the years have been the ones where, I might be out late at night and you're really tired and you just think, I need to go back, I need to get some sleep. And then you just force yourself, I'm here, I might as well do it. And invariably that'll turn out to be the one, just because you made yourself think, you just made the extra effort to get it. It's always usually worth it.
It's Paul Meacham. Thank you so much for listening into my conversation with former Buzzcocks drummer John Maher. Thank you to John. I had a great time talking about rock and roll and cars and photography, because that's what I like to do. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Paulie Rock Photo, and I'll tell you when you can join me for the next Rock N Roll Oblivion podcast. And thank you, Pete Shelley.